You are listening to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda. In December 2020, an article popped up on punknews.org titled, "Read a chapter from Aaron Carnes' In Defense of Ska about propaganda's Ska Sucks." I immediately contacted Aaron and he came on our January 2nd, 2021 Ska Sucks Part 2 episode, which I naively titled the Ska Sucks Bonus Episode Extravaganza, thinking there was no way we'd do more than 2 episodes about Ska Sucks, right? In January of 2021, the In Defense of Ska podcast launched with co-host Adam Davis from Link 80, Omnigon, and Dessa. In May 2021, Aaron Carnes' book In Defense of Ska was released. And since 2021, the In Defense of Ska podcast has been covering the stories of ska with incredible detail and to my immense enjoyment. In 2024, Aaron Carnes and Clash Books release In Defense of Ska, the Ska Now More Than Ever edition. I recorded an interview with Aaron for a totally different podcast about the second edition, and then he hit me up again and said, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did an Unscripted Moments exclusive cut and just talk about my edits to the Ska Sucks chapter as a standalone section?" Genius. So the first half hour of this Ska Sucks Part 5, the Holy Smokes More Ska Sucks edition, is exclusive to this podcast, and the 65 minutes beyond that include an interview I did with Aaron for a totally separate podcast. There is music separating the two sections. Go follow In Defense of Ska podcast, pre-order In Defense of Ska the second edition, scope out the guest list of the podcast, consider supporting what Aaron is doing. He's a pal, and I'm so glad that he's back on Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda. Please enjoy Ska Sucks Part 5.
Ska sucks! Ska revival isn't cool, you stupid fuck! The bets are only in for the bucks! And if you don't believe me, you're a schmuck! But the trend will die out with any lie! Oh yeah! Oh yeah!
Aaron Carnes, welcome back to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda.
I am honored to be back.
Aaron, it has been a while since you were on this podcast. Your episode that you were on turned out to be Ska Sucks Part 2 in what is now this will be Part 5. So Ska Sucks Part 1 was one of our earliest episodes. Ska Sucks Part 2 with you came out on January 2nd, 2021, and also featured a few members of the band Whole Lotta Milka.
Yeah.
And my friend Sam, who hosts Witch Police Radio in Winnipeg, who is also a deep ska enthusiast and fellow Fishbone fanatic, such as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So, Aaron, the way I found you is punknews.org. They published this article titled, "Read a chapter from Aaron Carnes' In Defense of Ska about propaganda's Ska Sucks." And so that article came out in December of 2020, and it was previewing your book. Is the first I ever heard of it. And they published this exclusive preview chapter about Ska Sucks. Tell me what you remember about that exclusive that punknews.org did with you back in the day.
I've known John Gentile from Punk News for a good number of years. He used to come see Narboots all the time because he lived in the Bay Area for a good chunk of time. I don't think he lives in Philadelphia. That's where he's from. But he found us somehow, and he would just come to like every show, and he would like cover us. There's like several write-ups he's done on Punk News for Narboots.
Yeah.
And he was one of the people I reached out to when I wrote the book and asked if he wanted to do anything on Punk News, and he suggested that we do a preview chapter and an interview. And that was one of 2 preview chapters. I did a preview chapter with Brooklyn Vegan, and we did the Jeff Rosenstock chapter. That one did incredibly well.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Punk News one that did really well too, because it connected you to me. So
Yeah. Okay, so the thing that obviously captured my attention is if you would have done a Jeff Rosenstock preview chapter with Punk News, I would have found you eventually, but it would have taken me longer, right? Because I would have had to be like, oh, wow, a book about ska. And I would have had to order it and I would have had to and I would have get pretty far into the book. And then I would have been like, oh my gosh, this whole chapter is about my favorite band Propaganda and their song Ska Sucks. So I'm super grateful that you did choose this particular chapter for the first edition of the book. Tell me what you remember about putting together the original edition of the Ska Sucks chapter for first edition of the book.
Well, I knew pretty early on I wanted to write about ska sucks because it's a thing that I remember in the 90s that song existed, and that song was sort of like a thing that irked ska fans, but also ska fans would like it and ska bands would play it. So it was simultaneously embraced and rejected by the ska scene in the 90s. So I thought that was really funny the way that the ska scene reacted to that song. And then at some point I had heard that the song was had to do with Nazis invading the scene. So that really fascinated me. And I was researching it and I couldn't really find much solid information out there about that for whatever reason. The only real good information I could find about it, aside from people kind of giving me hearsay, was Chris Hanna's interview on Turned Out a Punk.
Mm-hmm.
That was pretty much it, really.
Mm.
And even that was somewhat superficial. Like it kind of just
Mm-hmm.
went through the basic stuff. Like we were in the scene. We weren't a big band at the time. Uh, Nazis were continuously like interrupting our show. We didn't really know how to deal with it. Uh, a band from Toronto called Bunch of Fucking Goons. We played a show with
Goofs.
them. A bunch of fucking goofs. Yeah, no spaces.
Right.
Um, they said like you got to deal with these Nazis. You can't let them overrun your scene. We deal with them by kicking their ass. And then, as I understand it, the way Chris Hanna explained it on Turn On a Punk is he said he didn't feel comfortable trying to approach them in a violent way because he's not a violent person. So he came up with Ska Sucks as this way to like bring it to their attention that they thought they were idiots and make them uncomfortable in that way. I think that was the extent of what he explained on Turned Out a Punk.
Yeah.
So it kind of confirms the basic story, but doesn't really go too deep into it.
Were there any other materials that you were able to dig up? Because, doing a full chapter based on just that tiny little snippet, I mean, that's hard work too.
Yeah, I think what I did is I talked about other stuff around it too. Like you talked about having Whole Lotta Milka on the
Mm-hmm.
show. I talked about what they did, and what they did was they wrote a reaction song saying a message. Was it called A Message to You, Chris? I
A
think it was
message
called.
to you, Chris. Yeah.
So they were, and they knew that what the song was really about. And so I talked about them. I got a really funny fan letter from Whole Lotta Milka. Greg sent me this letter that was like, it's hilarious. The fan was just like saying, "Oh, I don't think you guys need to make that song. That's stupid. We don't, us Propaganda fans, we're not stupid. We don't do whatever Chris says. I don't, it's just." So I put that in there. And then
Amazing.
there was I talked about sort of what I said earlier, how like the ska scene sort of accepted and rejected it simultaneously. And that was, I think, pretty much the extent of what is in the chapter in the original edition.
Yeah. Well, shout out to Greg Crow from Whole Lotta Milka. Thank you, Greg, for doing the podcast way back when and telling the story. And something else I discovered by doing some digging is if you look at the CD version of Propaganda's 1998 compilation, where Quantity is job number one, next to the song Ska Sucks, it says, this is the song that caused ska bands to write songs about Chris.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it's like, oh boy. So it's just really funny the amount of things that kept happening around this song. And second thing, my girlfriend grew up in upstate New York in the mountains, really close to Lake Placid. And she's very amused that I do this insanely deep dive podcast into this one band. And she knew about Propaganda, but just this one song. So this is the song that my girlfriend knew in the mid 90s in relation to who this band was. But she did know who they were, but this is the only song that she knew. So this song is a powerful cultural phenomenon in punk and ska for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. If you take their entire catalog, how high up Ska Sucks ranks.
Hmm.
Because I mean, it's a well composed song in terms of the chords and the melody, but I'm sure that it was not a song that they pictured as a representation of them in any way at all.
Yeah. Um, and I've been trying to one of my main goals now on the internet is to get the ska or nah guy
Hmm.
to ask me
Jake,
if
yeah,
yeah, to ask me if I like ska. Um and I'm just waiting. I'm waiting for the day that I get asked that question. Because now doing 5 episodes of Ska Sucks, like surely I deserve to be asked that question
surely you do. Yes.
by now. So, Jake, if you're hearing this, please, I need to be asked. I'm not going to tell you what I think unless you ask. So
Hmm.
please ask. Um, okay, so Aaron, since you did the first edition of the book, I'm very delighted that you came back to talk about this again because, listeners out there, hopefully a bunch of them read your book and are listening to your In Defense of Ska podcast, which is now careening towards 200 episodes with your co-host Adam Davis from
Mm.
Omnigon, Link 80, and Dessa. So that is an unbelievable podcast you've got going on over there. Tons of your guests overlap with our guests here. So there is just like this wonderful little synchronicity between our two shows that has
Yes.
amused me ever since we began at virtually the exact same time in May and June of 2021. Um, what I want to know now is you have this second edition coming out, and I want to know explicitly and specifically about what you did to update the Ska Sucks section in the book. What has the journey been like for this particular chapter in the book for the second edition?
This is actually a chapter I'm really proud of in terms of how I updated it for the second edition. Um, there's a couple things that I was able to access that I didn't the first time. One of the things that I did was I talked to Against All Authority, which you did an episode with them on their
Yep.
cover of Ska Sucks. So I got this time, instead of saying that the ska scene embraced and rejected it, I got a quote from Danny to explain what they thought of the song and why they played it. And basically it was the gist of it was we thought it was funny. You
Mm,
know, they love ska. They thought it was funny that there was this song called Ska Sucks and that they were playing it and they were a ska band. Um, the other thing that I know I didn't really think about this too much before I talked to him, but he said like that when they would play shows that he would start playing the bass line and in seconds everyone knew what they were doing. And I was like, I guess that's true. I guess that's bass line is that recognizable that you just start playing it and a crowd who is familiar with this song, they know what you're doing.
yeah. I love it. Well, and I was also able to have Dave from Big D and the Kids Table on
That's
to
right.
talk
Yeah.
about their version of it as well. And it just thrills me to no end that Danny and Dave were enthusiastic about coming on and talking about these random covers that their bands did way back when. Um, so you're able to get this new information. You're able to update the chapter. What else did you?
So the big thing that was like a more minor thing, but the big thing was is that with your help, you pointed me to the fact that Chris Hanna has a Patreon and that he has a podcast on that Patreon, and then he kind of deep dives into his own music on that.
Yeah.
So the second episode of his podcast was about Haley Selassie
Mm-hmm.
up your ass, but in that episode he goes into pretty extreme detail about that song and Ska Sucks because I think he kind of thinks of them in a similar manner, like
Right.
songs that maybe had a specific reason why he wrote them that have really not held up and were really taken in a different direction than he intended.
Yeah.
And both of them, I think he feels like ended up being unintentionally racist as well.
Mm, yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Because, he goes into great depth on the show about it. I was wondering what your reaction was to Chris's own critique of the songs between 27 and 30 years after they were released.
Well, I definitely appreciate that Chris is so self-reflective to do that because I feel like people are often so defensive about things that they create that if they would say like I created this for this reason and people are misunderstanding it, that's on them, not
Yeah.
having a self-reflective moment about it, and even wondering why you decided that you needed to create that. I think in the case with Haley Selassie, he was talking about it being a reaction to learning about Bad Brains, who were his favorite band, learning about their homophobia,
Yeah.
and also kind of then going from that to going to the homophobia that's in Rastafarianism. And the point he made, which I think is a very valid one, is that yes, it is true that there is homophobia in Rastafarianism, and that Bad Brains said some pretty gross stuff back in the day. That there also is this other layer that's happening, and that's that them being a black band, Rastafarianism being a religion, for people of darker skin color, that they might get this sort of worse than like people like white bands in the 80s who were hardcore that said homophobic stuff. Like, why isn't there a big backlash against them? And other religions that are very homophobic that that exist, and why aren't they viewed in that same way? So that was really the point of view that he came across, that there is a sort of subtle racism when it comes to who you villainize for things that deserve to be villainized and who you kind of give a pass to.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Bad Brains song that I believe was explicitly mentioned from their Quickness album, um, Bad Brains have also gotten rid of that song as well. I believe that they reissued that album and reissued the particular song in question purely as an instrumental on a 25-year or 30-year reissue or whatever. I know that there's been some modification in that song as well in the Bad Brains camp, which is pretty cool to see too.
Yeah, I don't know too much about Bad Brains, but I do get the sense that HR, I'm not sure how tethered he is to reality, and the rest of the band do not like really care for that legacy. So,
Hmm. Yeah. When you were thinking about revising this chapter, were you able to get in touch with Chris at all and chat about the song?
I joined the Patreon, I listened to it, I took notes, and then I asked Chris. I told Chris who I was, what I do, and I asked him if I could use pieces of his Patreon, um, and I could quote it in my book, and he said, "Go ahead." That's really it. But you know, if it was not a Patreon exclusive podcast, I don't feel like I would have been compelled to or even needed to do that, because it's public. It's like if you read a New York Times article, you can quote it as long as you say this is from the New York Times, right? But I don't know, actually, I don't know what the legal thing is for a Patreon exclusive podcast. So it just felt like I think I probably should ask permission for this. I don't know.
Hey, I just think that's like a kind and classier move anyway.
Yeah.
It's cool. It's
Um,
cool that you did
I
that.
w- I was hoping he would talk to me about it more, but he didn't. But he didn't really say. I don't know. I asked him. I said, "You want to read it?" He said, "Sure," and then he never like commented on what I wrote.
Gotcha.
Um, but that's fine. He's a busy guy.
The
But so and but
opportunity
he
was given.
However, in his podcast, he talked more detail about how this scene had like skinheads, Nazi skinheads that would come to the show, and that they would be wearing screwdriver shirts and then special shirts. So I think he really I think he identified ska with these people. And I think that's part of where that kind of like that anger came from, is like seeing these like guys with special shirts causing this mayhem at these shows and being like, fuck you.
Yeah,
So
totally.
I can understand that. But I think what the conclusion he came to in retrospect is that those guys don't represent ska, right?
Yeah.
You can't blame ska on what those guys were doing, because those guys were like white supremacists do. They are completely misunderstanding and the thing that they love, right? Like, why do they even like the Specials to begin with? A band with pretty politically leftist, overtly anti-racist lyrics, and with members who are both white and black. It's just the antithesis of what they're about. Yet, I don't know. Yeah, they're down with it.
Yeah. Well, Aaron, something I want to ask about since you brought up the specials and since the Ska Sucks song explicitly is, derived from stuff around the specials, I gotta tell you, man, their record that they did a few years back called Encore, dude, that record
Mhm.
rules. Have you listened to this newer specials era?
Yeah, that's probably the only specials record beyond the original ones that I like. I think the rest of them are just kind of fall a little flat. A lot of covers and stuff like that.
Yeah, that Vote for Me song, man, there is some dark tone on these
Hmm.
records. Like this specials record, man. I gotta tell you, I was listening to that a couple years ago, and I was like, this record is absolutely fantastic. So shout out to the specials for keeping it going and putting out some bangers late in their career. It's really, really cool to see.
So after I kind of listened to this and I thought about this some more and I kind of worked in some of the stuff in the chapter, I was talking to Greg a little bit more about this, and I told him what I had been learning, and I said, something I guess I didn't really think about much in the first time is that if this song was written to sort of push Nazis out of the scene, did it work? I mean, did they stop coming to shows? And he said that as far as he knows, it they were coming to less shows, but he's not really sure if it had to do with Chris's song because he said there was a high profile hate crime perpetrated by one of them that led to a murder, whether it was intentional or not, and
Hmm.
that there was like police, you know, kind of like there was just a lot more heat on them, so they kind of disappeared. So the conclusion is it's uncertain if it had anything to do with the song or not. That they had other things going on,
Yeah, I would imagine the
and
murder was a little more influential than Chris Hanna singing Ska Sucks at the Royal Albert on a random Thursday night. But I'm not going to draw total conclusions on that at this time. Um, so
oh
how much updating to the chapter were you able to do? Did this chapter get like a pretty serious revision? Because I know the book got tons of revisions, huge amounts of revisions for the new edition. I think you said like tens of thousands of extra words. Every
yeah.
chapter got revised. How did this one go?
Well, I think like the stuff that I've already said, I think is gives it a lot better context. And another thing that I added, and I say that I feel like I got a pretty good. Chris said this. I would have loved to have seen Fat Mike say this. So I haven't read Fat Mike saying this yet, but Chris basically said that Fat Mike insisted that they put Ska Sucks on the record, that the
Yeah.
band did not want to put Fat Ska Sucks on the record, that they thought it was a too much of a gimmicky song, but Fat Mike thought it was hilarious and was like, you got to put this song on there. So they felt like, he was the one paying the bills, so they basically had to. Um, that was another interesting insight to learn about. The other thing, kind of related to that, and I did get some, I did listen to some Fat Mike interviews that kind of confirm that, is that Fat Mike feels the need to be very involved on a band's first record that he releases on Fat Records. He feels
Hmm.
like, and I got a quote from him, not directly, just from a podcast I listened to, where he said, I got to make sure that the first record I put on Fat Record is perfect and great and everyone loves it. And after that, the band could do whatever they want, because the first one is all that really matters. So
Yeah.
that really confirms his level of involvement on How to Clean Everything.
I mean, he still talks about that record to this day. A few months back when he was doing an interview on, I can't remember what YouTube interview he did, but he brought up How to Clean Everything just a few months ago in completely glowing language, and he still talks about it to this day as the record that defined the Fat Record sound. But yeah, there's definitely some stuff on this record that if I was sequencing the record, I would not include. Like, I would not have included Ska Sucks. I would not have included This Might Be Satire. I would not have included Highly Salass Up Your Ass. I would have put songs like Government Cartoons and Homophobes Are Just Pissed Because They Can't Get Laid and songs like those on instead. But, I'm
which
not a
was
record
which
label.
was intended, right? Isn't that what Chris said?
Yeah,
There
yeah,
was
yeah, because they did the 7 inch where there's homophobes are just pissed because they can't get laid, which was left off the record. There was Pigs Will Pay, which was also left off the record. There was a 7 inch that was put out. One of the tracks was put on the first Fat Records compilation. So there were other tracks. The exact amount of tracks that were needed to replace some of my least favorite songs are ones that would have fit really nicely. But like you said, you take off Ska Sucks, and then you don't have that iconic bass riff that Danny Lore from Against All Authority can play at ska shows and draw everybody in. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, Chris actually said on his podcast that they wanted those songs to be on the record and not Scott Sucks and Haley Celeste. So
Yeah,
I think the sequencing that they wanted was the one that you wanted. Um, so who knows what the legacy of the record would have been if they'd had gotten the record that they wanted.
I know. It might have sold way less. It's truly possible that leaving those songs off the record could change the entire trajectory of how well that record did commercially. Because if you go on Fat Records' website, you can sort for best-selling albums on their website store to this day. And I think that How to Clean Everything is like the third or fourth ranked highest selling record in all of Fat
Wow.
Records' entire recorded history. Still sells.
Now, so one thing Chris said on that podcast too, and I'm sure you've covered this in different ways on this podcast, is that some of the stuff that we're talking about in relation to these songs and the reaction to How to Clean Everything directly impact how he approached more rock, less talk, because he felt like he did not like the confusing messages on How to Clean Everything, and he didn't like how people were taking the songs in directions he didn't necessarily intend. So
Yeah.
he felt like he wanted to make sure people understood exactly who Propagandhi were, exactly what they stood for, and there'd be no like confusion at all. And I think them putting gay positive and pro feminism on the album cover was part of that campaign to be like, this is who we are. There's no misunderstanding who we are and what we're about.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Aaron, this has been a really nice little peek into the process. Was there anything else that rings your memory about the first edition, the second edition, the revision process, like what readers can expect to see from that chapter? Or do you think that we kind of did an okay overview of it?
I think we did a good overview, but I think like what I did for this chapter, it varies chapter to chapter, but I did for this chapter is I was able to sort of hone in on some holes or some areas that I felt like I kind of had to brush over for lack of information. Now I feel like the chapter reads much better and has like just a lot more detail, and I feel like you can really understand everything a lot better of like why the song was created, how it was intended, how it was misunderstood, and what its continued legacy is. Like to this day, I mean, actually somebody had told me that they feel like the Ska Sucks thing has been totally, everyone knows now, but I don't think that's the case. Like when I did a book event with Dan Ozzie in 2022 at Silver Sprocket in San Francisco, and at the end I was doing a little Q&A on my section, and he said, what's the song that did the most damage for ska in the 90s, and why is it Ska Sucks?
Mm,
And I laughed, and then I said, well, that song was never intended to mock ska. That wasn't its intention. And I don't think he knew that. And
yeah.
I explained the whole history of it, and I mean, although in a sense he's not totally wrong, I do think that's the legacy the song took on, and it became that sort of theme song to people who hated ska or thought it was funny to mock ska. Be like, ska sucks. That's
Yeah,
the
I mean,
song.
I recently got to talk to John K. Sampson from Propaganda for the only time that I'll ever likely talk to him for this podcast project. And he reiterated, he's like, back then we were really writing songs for 50 of our friends in these tiny clubs in Winnipeg. And then all of a sudden we're being signed by this record label in California because of opening up for No Effects one time. So the the tininess of who these songs are originally meant to be heard by, it really is the immediate social circle of all the people that you can hear in the recording, in the live tracks from the Where Quantity is Job Number One CD compilation, where they're calling out their friends by name from the stage. They're like, "Oh, LaPlante, come up here." They're talking to their friends from the stage on the floor. And that's who was meant to hear Ska Sucks, is like the people that are in that recording in Winnipeg in like 1990, 1991, 1992. So the tininess of the intended audience for these particular songs is absolutely hilarious when you think about it.
And also the other point that Chris had brought up in that same podcast episode is that they in no way expected this record to do well. How to Clean Everything. They were excited to get a little bit more of a budget than they had in the past, but they didn't think it would be this big thing. They didn't think it would be even a moderate thing. They just thought, we're going to get a record and we're going to put it out there and we're going to go tour. So they didn't in any way anticipate people, all the punk scene and all the ska scene knowing this song,
Yeah. Well, Aaron, what listeners on this podcast now can expect is another hour and 5 minutes of you and me talking about the second edition of the book for a conversation that we recorded yesterday for a totally different podcast where we go into your second edition book in a lot of detail. And I'm really delighted to bring this exclusive propaganda section to this podcast, because to me, it's just like such an important piece of your book, because it's how I found you. It's how our friendship began. And I'm just really delighted that we were able to do this exclusive little section for this show only that isn't even going to be on the other interview. But since we did talk about your entire book for an hour and 5 minutes yesterday, the listeners on this podcast can just keep on hitting that play button and you'll get the entire rest of the conversation for the rest of the book. But Aaron, I mean, it's been a wonderful last 4 years, keeping in touch with you, watching In Defense of Ska, being a patron, getting the behind the scenes episodes that you do on Patreon is one of my favorite parts of my podcast refreshing activities. So I just love your show. I love what you and Adam are doing. Your guests are fantastic. You hit some of my childhood too, man. Talking so much about Link 80 and MU330. So if any listeners out there haven't listened to In Defense of Ska, just go scope out that guest list, because it's really going to rock you. But Aaron, do you have any other closing thoughts or suggestions for the exclusive propaganda section of this interview?
Too hot for the other network.
It is. It's too hot.
No, I think that you and I had a great interview that they're about to listen to, but I'll say at the top of it, in case they don't feel like listening to the whole thing, that my book is available to be pre-ordered right now at clashbooks.com. Just go to the books tab and it should be right there. Follow In Defense of Ska at In Defense of Ska on all social media platforms. And check out the podcast.
Aaron, what's your favorite social media platform for the podcast right now?
I guess it used to be Twitter, back when it was Twitter, but now I think I'm more about Instagram at this point. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, folks, we're going to go into the next hour and 5 minutes of me and Aaron talking one day prior to the section we are recording now. Thank you so much for listening, and please keep going on this episode. We talk about the book in great detail. Go check out In Defense of Ska, second edition, and you get to learn about it right now. Aaron, thanks so much for joining Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda.
Thank you.
You guys listen to ska and shit? Yeah. That shit sucks. Like, it is terrible. Like, fuck. Fuck.
message to you, Rudy? What message to you, Rudy? Fuck you, Rudy! Fuck you, Rudy!
Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Aaron, I'm wondering if you can just spend a moment and introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know
Sure.
who you are and what you do.
My name's Aaron Carnes. I've been a music journalist since about 2009. In 2021, I released a book called In Defense of Ska. I guess you could say I wrote it because I've been a long time ska fan and I've been a long time music journalist. And I think through the course of being a music journalist, I really got a good sense of how dismissed ska was. And I think I just really made me want to give ska like a proper book and stuff. When I start a few months before the book was released, I started a podcast called In Defense of Ska. Its intention was primarily to promote the book. And a lot of it was probably driven by the fact that we were in a pandemic and I didn't really know A, how to promote a book, but also B, how to promote a book while not being able to go places physically. So I decided on a podcast. I took a podcast class.
What? Oh my gosh, amazing.
Which I don't think was super helpful. Although I think the one thing that was helpful for is the intro, the format that we have. I got from that class. It was like a little bit of music, me doing this sort of like introduction, Adam and I chit-chatting a little bit, and then go into the interview. I kind of got that from the class, and it's funny because now I listen to like more podcasts than I did back then, and I see like, oh, a lot of people actually don't do it that way. They're actually like, hey, they bullshit for like 10 minutes and then they
Yeah.
talk, and I'm like, I don't like that. I like, tell me what the episode's about and jump into the episode. And I guess my the money I paid for that podcast class was worth it for that. Our first episode, I mean, it'll already be out by the time this episode's out, but our first episode on our new network Consequences is dropping in a few days, and like we like retooled our intro a little bit too,
Oh, cool.
just to even kind of more hone in on that sort of professional. I guess it's what's interesting is the podcast is it is free form, interview, but it's like a middle ground between being very structured and being like letting a conversation go where it needs to go, because I
Yeah.
have very, very like detailed outline of where I want it to go, and I have an arc in mind, and I have a pretty clear interview like intro setup. But yeah, stuff still goes in chaotic directions too. So
Aaron, let's chat about some ska here real quick. You're
yes.
also a musician. You played drums in a band called Flat Planet in the 90s. And you were on some compilations and did some touring and did some roadieing. But I'm curious about what your earliest memories of ska are. Like, take me back to like kind of the very beginning of your origin in this genre of music that you've spent your life documenting.
The first time that I was aware of something called ska was in '92 when I went and saw Skank and Pickle play at a venue in Santa Clara, California called One Step Beyond. I don't know exactly why I went there. I feel like someone I knew, because I was into underground music and punk and like the funk metal stuff. So somebody cued me in on like, oh, check out this band, Skank Pickle. They were basically local. I mean, I lived in Gilroy. They were from like San Jose, Los Gatos, which is about a half hour apart. And I was totally blown away. Full horn section, the style of music I didn't really understand anything about, but also they played like every style. They played reggae, funk, punk, all that stuff. But I was like a fan. I was sold. I was on board. I did a deep dive like immediately, and I just kind of shifted my interest towards ska. But the funny thing is, and this is something that I've like realized more in like the last like 3 or 4 years. I don't know why it took me this long to realize it, but I was already a fan of Fishbone,
Hmm.
and I was a fan of Mr. Bungle, their first record. And both of, Fishbone, obviously they played a lot of ska. I mean, they played a lot of other stuff too. And they often weren't like necessarily called ska. They were called alternative, particularly in the 90s. So I didn't really think about Fishbone having like these different styles that they were playing. It was just like it's Fishbone. They're just crazy, right? And then
Yeah.
Mr. Bungle, same thing. Like I loved that first record so much when it came out. I just thought it was like, okay, they're going to this like crazy carousel sections. That's how I thought of it. But now it's like I realize those are ska sections. They were playing ska. And we even interviewed Trevor Dunn, the bassist, recently, and yeah, we went into we went into detail about their ska history and them falling in love with Fishbone and being really into like Bad Manners and Oingo Boingo. So I mean, it was intentional. It wasn't, it really is very legitimate like ska stuff happening on that first record. So I just think back at how funny it was that I was already into this music. Just I didn't had no language for it or understand it as a separate genre until that Skank and Pickle show.
For me, my first memories of ska would definitely be, Real Big Fish, Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, partially, no doubt, Sublime. Watching MTV and VH1 in 1994, 1995, like that kind of era. The impression that I get music video from Mighty Mighty Boss Tones stands out hugely in my mind.
Mhm.
Same with the Sublime videos, and then Sellout by Real Big Fish, So these things, and my first ever show ever in my whole life was Blink-182 on the Dude Ranch tour with Travis Barker playing drums for the Aquabats, who opened for Blink-182 in February of 1998. So for me, I got ska immediately in my first ever live show. So I mean, it's a pretty important thing whenever I think about the history, my own history within music as well as a fan.
Yeah. How old are you? Because you're a little younger than me, so you kind of came to ska more as it was a mainstream genre, right?
Yes, I just turned 40 in November of
Oh,
2023. So I was 14 years old, seeing that Blink-182 Aquabats show in 98, and my dad took me and my two friends. So I was there, I saw Travis Barker in the Baron Von Tito costume, uh back there ripping it up for the Aquabats.
yeah, I'm 48, so I think that my book and my podcast reflects my experience a little bit more, and that's that I came to ska while it was an underground genre
Yeah.
and got really into it as it was growing away from the mainstream and then watched it become a mainstream genre and had very negative feelings about that. So, but I imagine, a lot of people I talk to that are your age, they come to ska through it as a mainstream genre and then they dig deeper. And so a lot of them feel like, well, yeah, there's better bands than XYZ that were on the radio, but if it wasn't for these bands, I wouldn't have discovered the other stuff. And so, and I can kind of understand that, and it's kind of like opened up my own perspective about the role that ska being a mainstream genre has had.
Oh, totally. And for me, another huge one is Time Bomb by Rancid, and then realizing that Rancid was used to be Operation Ivy.
Yeah.
So for me, like that 1994, 1995, that window is so, so important for me. And I'm sure that if there's anybody out there who's 40 who knows ska like me, that's probably their exact same entry point as well. So that's pretty cool to think about, just the differences in your
Mhm.
experience and mine, and how we're
Yeah,
like
exactly.
eight years apart, and just seeing that little differential, I love it. Um, so for there are people out there who might be listening to this conversation who have only listened to ska, maybe only heard one or two ska songs in their life. Most likely, the ones that they can think of would be the impression that I get by the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones and maybe a No Doubt song or a Sublime song. And I'm wondering if you can just give a sort of a potted description, for lack of a better term, of the waves of
Okay,
ska that happened since its origin. Kind of like tell listeners about their like a little bit about the fluctuation throughout time.
great. I love this question because I have a different perspective than I think is sort of the common narrative about the waves. And also, I'll say this: I use the term ska pretty liberally,
Hmm.
but ska I think of more as like a major genre category like rock or jazz. So much about ska is about its subgenres, and it all falls within that ska sort of major category. But when we're speaking about ska, what it really is, as when ska is ska, just like it is Jamaican ska from late 1950s to early 60s. That is ska. It is a form of music that predates rocksteady and predates reggae. It incorporated a lot of different things, like it incorporated jazz and incorporated American R&B, particularly like the New Orleans, kind of the grittier version of R&B, and mento, which is sort of more like a folk music from Jamaica. So these elements sort of kind of like organically created Jamaican ska. And it had an upbeat sound. It wasn't like particularly political the way reggae became, and it wasn't complete. It wasn't so like love stricken the way Rocksteady was, but it also sort of evolved at a time when Jamaica was had its independence. So I'm sure that sort of impacted its joyful sound, its dancey sound. But Jamaica's a land where something comes up and they move on to something different, and that's been the story of ska. So everything that we think of and we're talking about that's not Jamaican ska, I call it, I don't really call it this publicly, but I think of it as ska revival because it
Mm.
all stems from two-tone ska, which is from late 70s England, the Specials, the Selector, Madness. These bands, primarily the Selector, if you're looking at the real origin, and Jerry Dammers, the keyboard player, they were consciously taking these old ska records from like the 60s that were out and around at record stores, in England, and they were deliberately like mixing them with the punk and the alternative and post-punk music that was happening in England at that particular time. It was something that was very thought about, like let's initially the Specials were trying to mix reggae and punk because reggae was very popular and punk, both of these things were very political and they were very popular. Reggae was popular with punks, and they just couldn't really make the energy of these sounds work together. And so Jerry was like, let's go back further and mix it with ska and rocksteady and early skinhead reggae. And that's basically what you have with the Specials and sort of
Mm.
the ska revival scene is that conscious effort. And let's be political. Let's be very political. Let's address what's happening right now in England, which a lot of the music does. Some of the stuff you listen to two-tone ska stuff, and you're like, yes, I know exactly what they're talking about, and I feel it. Some of it, you're like, what are they talking about? Because they were addressing very specific issues of their time and place. So a lot of people like to call that second wave, and then they say third wave. It was 90s ska. I think this is where I feel like we need to depart on the common narrative because I see it as ska revival. And what ska revival did was it birthed a whole new global sort of ska movement, if you will. And within that movement, you see all sorts of subgenres being birthed. And it's all happening at once, really. I mean, yes, a little bit later you see ska core and other things like that, but really people are taking ska. Two Tone has shown people that you could sort of mix ska with other things, and they're just taking it in every direction
Hmm.
because it's been the new established version of ska because Jamaican ska really wasn't something that spread globally to the extent that two-tone ska did. Two-tone ska got all over the world. It was very, very popular in England. It was top 40 music. Tapes and CDs found their way all over the planet. In the US, it wasn't that big. It was kind of a culty thing, but people in America, in New York and LA that just like love weird British stuff, they ate it up. And a
Yeah.
lot of those people started bands and they kind of created scenes in their own cities. And, it took a while before it like really caught on in the US.
Something that I love that you just said is the you mentioned like ska core and things like that and the way that it branches out. Like I remember seeing one of my first shows was like the Toasters
Mhm.
in like the early 2000s, and Big D and the Kids Table was opening up. So like I was seeing this generational divide between like this like late 70s sound from New York City mixed with like what came later. And I love the way that the worlds kind of blended right before my very eyes, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, like some important bands from my point of view in terms of their different takes on ska were like Fishbone, obviously, who played a lot more ska in the 80s than they did in the 90s. They introduced like this concept of like really you can play everything with ska, and they were so good at every genre that it worked well. In Argentina, you had Los Fabulosos Cadillacs, who really kind of were one of the first like bands in Latin America to play ska and mix those elements with it, and they went on to be a really big band by the 90s. Operation Ivy, obviously, they were punks first, and they kind of showed that ska could be played by punks and be treated as a punk subgenre, even though it isn't. but they treated it like that. Tokyo Ska Paradise Orchestra started in the late
Mhm.
80s in Japan. They mixed all kinds of really cool elements with ska, and they're a level of musicianship that I've never seen of any ska band ever. Like I saw them last year at Supernova, and it was mind blowing. Like they were perfect. Everything was absolutely perfect. Hepcat kind of drew on traditional ska. The Busters from Germany, they kind of did like kind of skinhead reggae ska stuff. Suicide Machines, Against All Authority were like a great ska or a great punk ska band. Mighty Mighty Boss Tones like mixed hardcore metal ska. Um, I could go on and on and on, but my point is like this is not a singular line. This is like a web that blew up
Yeah.
from Two Tone ultimately. I mean, yes, some of these bands start later than others, and Fishbone is a huge, very influential band on everything that came after it. But ultimately, ska just kind of went in every direction. So that's why I don't really like to say third wave because it didn't really happen like a wave. It happened like,
Yeah.
and it's still the case today. Like, there's new bands forming and what is informing their style of ska. It could be anything. And more bands now mix ska with emo, for instance, which wasn't a big thing
Hmm.
in the 90s. But a lot of them grew up when ska and emo were both a thing. And so now that's their sort of ingredients. Now the thing about all this is like what happened in the 90s in like 95 to 97 or so was Real Big Fish, Save Ferris, Less Than Jake, Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, Goldfinger, these bands got on the radio. These bands sort of came to represent ska, but they're primarily bands that are mixing pop punk and ska.
Hmm.
So it's a very singular perspective of ska. And I think that was good for marketing to kids in the 90s on MTV, but it's bad for people who think of ska as like, well, it's just this one thing and it's like kind of a superficial thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, without my friend who dug into it a little bit more deeply, I never would have discovered Moon Records, for example. I had
Mhm.
one friend who got really into it because he played bass and he was like really amazed by the bass playing in some of the ska that he was listening to. So he kept digging into it, found this entirely other world. And then you had things like Hellcat Records start to put out records by bands like Dave Hilliard and the Rocksteady Seven and
Yeah.
Hepcat and bands like that. So it's a really interesting way that it found people like me who were very into the NoFX, Bad Religion, Pennywise world, and then the way that ska infiltrated. Because when I found the Suicide Machines, Destruction by Definition, and Battle Hymns, and Link 80 on Asian Man Records, like those were the sounds with the speed and the tempo and the aggression that looped in the ska that made me see like, oh, these worlds are so much more blended than I ever gave them credit for. And that's really what drew me in, is finding the bands that had the speed and the aggression that I was used to and sought out, but then seeing those other record labels that kind of bridged that gap for me. I loved it.
Hellcat's so interesting because that's Tim Armstrong's label. And, Tim Armstrong with Rancid, they had Time Bomb, huge hit, one of the major sort of ska studio. It's a subsidiary of Epitaph. Every single ska record that was released on Hellcat is awesome.
Yeah.
And none of them were mainstream.
The Gadgets, that Gadgets record
Yeah.
that came out, holy smokes, unbelievable. Um, well, Aaron, you're on the second edition now of In
Yes.
Defense of Ska, the book, right? Here's my first edition right here, with
Mm.
the original cover with the Gilman Street, and I even have a signed copy that I got whenever the book first came out. And looking back over the 3 years since the first edition of this book came out, I'm wondering what like some of your fondest memories of putting all the pieces of the book together are. Like, if you're feeling reflective and nostalgic as you move towards the next iteration and edition of the book, what are you looking back on as some of your fondest memories of getting it all together in the first place?
For the first edition or the second edition?
Well, we can do the first edition first, and then if you want to talk about the second, we can.
Well, my fondest memory of putting the first edition together was getting to go to Mexico I went to Mexico in, it would be 2019. So I'd been working on a chapter about ska scene in Mexico. Actually, where that started was I back you go back to 2015. I had written an article for Playboy about LA's Latino ska scene,
Mm.
and I was aware of that because Eddie from Voodoo Glow Skulls told me about it. He's like, I was talking to him at Gilman. We're friends, we know each other okay. And he was just telling me, he's like, you'd be blown away if you see what's going on in East LA right now. It's out of control. It's so big, and they have their own bands, like local bands, and they're doing super well. They have these big festivals there,
Is that
and I was like,
Ska Wars Festival?
yeah, Sky Wars.
Awesome.
And so he told me that. And the thing about Voodoo is that since they're a primarily Latino band from Riverside, they're not like, that wasn't their scene per se, but they all love Voodoo, and they all kind of made them sort of an honorary member of that scene.
Yeah.
And they also, a fun fact about Voodoo Glow Skulls, they released a all Spanish version of their second record,
Yeah. Is that
Ferme.
Baila de los Locos?
No. Their first record, Ferme, they
Oh,
just
they
released
did.
a Spanish version of Ferme. Like, so that was their first record on Epitaph, right? That's
Yeah.
and then like, it was like 95, I think. And so then the next year, 96, they's like, here's the Spanish version. Um, but like, you didn't really see that. Like, you didn't see
Right.
like Spanish punk or Spanish alternative kind of hitting that market at all. I mean, even like Oso Motley didn't like put out their first record for a few years after that. So that's a
I
little
love it.
sidebar. Yeah. So anyways, like I kind of looked into a little bit more, and I had like a connection at Playboy. I had just started writing freelancing there, and I pitched the article to the editor. He's like, that sounds awesome. And I went down to Ska Wars, and it was like, yeah, I would say about 3,000 people. It was at a park in East LA, very DIY, but huge. I'd never seen a local DIY scene just so vibrant. And like the thing that really struck me about it was that it was really filled with young people. It wasn't a bunch of old people who grew up with this music and they're still supporting it 20 years later. But I mean, bless the old people like myself that
Yeah.
do that. Uh, it was a bunch of young people, and they were so into it, and they knew all the lyrics to these local bands, and they were just dancing like crazy. Anyways, I'm working on my book late, a couple of years later, and I'm like, well, I gotta have a chapter about that scene and go deeper into that scene. It's so cool. And I'm talking to Clemente Ruiz, who's like the main person who I interviewed for the article. And by the way, Clemente told me when that article came out, I was like, you're the first person to cover this scene that really got it right. And I was like, that's I feel so honored that you say that. I mean, I'm not from that area, but I guess I understand. Maybe it's because I understand ska, so maybe that's why.
Mm.
Um, so I was starting to interview him again for the book, and he's like, you gotta go to Mexico. You got to see what's happening in Mexico because it is crazy in Mexico. There's festivals happening in Mexico City with like 20,000 plus people, and I'm like, okay, I'm down. Let's go. And
I'm
so
going.
yeah, so he's like, I'll let you know when there's like a good festival coming up. And so I'm working. I'm getting my book done. It's actually getting close to when I need to turn in my book. And so he's like, okay, so there's this festival in Oaxaca. It's not the epicenter of the scene, but a lot of the primary bands are playing there. So I would recommend you just go to that one. It's not the 20,000 people at Mexico City shows, but you're going to get a sense of it. And I was like, okay, so I brought my friend Alex, who was the singer for my band in the 90s, and we went. It was at like this football field. There was like two stages, one on either side. There was probably like 10,000, maybe 8 to 10,000 people there. And like
Jeez.
because of Clemente, he got me, he talked to them and like got me so I can go backstage and talk to the bands and everything. And I'm talking to like this organizer guy there, and he's like, this is kind of small, but it's our first time doing this. So hopefully we'll get a little momentum and kind of make this a little bigger. I was like, this is small. Are you serious?
Man, so you got to do some travel, have some unexpected experiences. Were those experiences like in East LA and Mexico pretty shocking for you to just see like how vibrant the genre was still going in certain parts of the world that a lot of people aren't paying attention to?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I'm kind of used to it, but yeah, at the time, I think it was surprising. And I think what's interesting about it, the thing that struck me the most about it is like you go to different countries, you go to different areas, there's different cultures, but it's like kind of the same. Like
Mm,
kids are, they dance a little different, but it's kind of the same, the similar energy, the way they're dressing, kind of the way they're acting at a show. It's like, it really kind of like being in Mexico really made me realize how it's like we all love the same thing. Like
hmm.
kids in Mexico at these shows, me as a kid going to these shows, like we're getting the same thing out of it. Like it really does like just it is like this universal thing.
Yeah. Let's dive into a little bit of details about the second edition. I'm wondering
Yeah.
what was cool or challenging specifically about doing a second edition of a book because, doing a first edition of a book is hard enough in and of itself. Revisiting, updating, revising something that's been out for a couple of years has got to be just a brand new kind of challenge. And I'm just curious about what that was like for you.
I would say my biggest challenge with this was knowing if this was the right place to put my energy and wondering where the line is. Like, am I putting too much time into this? Am I going a little too obsessive with this? Like some of those thoughts were definitely kind of in the back of my mind as I was moving forward because I ended up going kind of deep into what I how I revised it. Like, I mean, some
Mm,
people might be like, I did it, I gave it a new copy edit and I added a thing at the end, new edition, new cover. That might be how most people approach it. I didn't approach it that way. I approached it by I went through and I re-edited every single chapter and I looked into each chapter and I said, is there anything missing that I can add? And in some cases, I added a section, and in some cases, I added a sentence.
mm.
You know what I mean? I went a little overboard with it. I did. I might do a new interview for a section because I'm like, this could really use this. And then I wrote this whole extra chapter at the end, which is kind of a long chapter, but it's really like a collection of chapters. But I just called it one chapter. And overall, there's like 30,000 more words in this book than the first edition. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, you just really reignited my excitement because all I've seen from this book so far, you sent me the digital edition, but
Yeah.
it doesn't have the same power if you hold a first edition book
Sure.
and then you have the second edition in your hand right next to it to kind of like give them the physical comparison. So you just reignited my curiosity in edition number two because this was my summer beach book when the first edition came out. I read this on the beach overlooking Lake Erie just south of Buffalo in the middle of the summer, and it was my beach read. So I'm excited because I'll have a new beach read for the summer of 2024 where I reinvestigate my ska
Yes.
knowledge.
One of the funny things about it is like I went through and like each, all the chapters, like I was saying, and I would kind of think about it and research or maybe set up some interviews, or maybe I would dig deep in some articles and fill out some stuff. But also what's going on at the same time is I'm doing this podcast,
Yeah.
and every episode of the podcast I'm doing is expanding my knowledge. And sometimes it directly affects,
Yeah.
like, oh, this chapter here, I just talked to so and so, and he really kind of broadened my understanding of this specific thing I wrote about. And that would inform, and I would just use that. I would just be like, oh, okay, so here I could fill out this section a little bit more. And maybe I'd talk to that person, and be like, hey, I'm doing this, or do you have anything else to add? And it worked out great. But it also led to a couple really, to me, really funny little additions. Um, because the podcast, we bring on so many people outside of ska,
Hmm.
and every once in a while they have such an interesting little take on the scene. So I used a quote, and with their permission, I used a quote from John Darnielle
Yep.
and I used a quote from Kyle Kinane,
Nice.
I would never have reached out to these people to get an interview for this book. It would make no sense, but they had a couple funny quotes that I just felt were so good. With John Darnielle, I did have a chapter where I'm going down the list of like, this is what's happening in the 90s when ska's blowing up in the mainstream, and I'm kind of listing out the bands who are blowing up, what their singles were, blah blah blah. John Darnielle on our episode had a really great quote about Goldfinger's song Superman.
Nice.
So
Love that
I
song
used, I
too.
used his quote for that. And then with Kyle Kinane, he came from Chicago. He grew up going to Fireside. He grew up going to slapstick shows. And he had like a really funny quote about how Fireside Bowl, where all the punk shows were, was like this little tiny space with no stage and everybody crowded in there. And he went on this whole rant about how like he always felt worried, like a mother, like someone was going to hit their face with the trombone and blah blah blah, so I use that quote in there too. It was just like add a little color, but it's like it must be really funny if someone reading it, they're like, oh, here's the story of slapstick and a Fireside, and here's a quote from Kyle Kinane for some random reason.
hmm Well, and I've been to Fireside myself, and it's a really bizarre place. If anybody out there listening ever goes to Chicago and you're on Fullerton in Chicago and you see the Fireside Bowl, you should go in there and try to process having massive punk shows there, because it's such a bizarre space to have shows. But for anybody out there listening who doesn't know who John Darnielle is, he's a best-selling novelist and also the singer and songwriter for a band called the Mountain Goats, which are extremely prolific. And Kyle Kinane is a very funny comedian. So definitely some nice little shout outs there. So you mined the podcast
Oh
interviews
yeah. Oh
for
yeah.
additions to the book?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't sit and listen to every episode, but I sent and like went through, my feed, and I was like, okay, this person, what did we talk about in this episode? And I would kind of think about it and I maybe scrub through it, and I'd be like, oh, okay, there's some stuff here, and I literally went through each episode, at least
Yeah.
considering what would be potentially helpful.
That is amazing because at 180 episodes or so of the podcast now, with many more in the works, you have a gold mine of information that you could have drawn from for this book. So I'm just delighted to hear that you did, because the
Mhm.
podcast is an entity in and of itself that is like just so complimentary of the book that so like seeing the podcast as well is like, wow, this is so deep.
Thank you. Yeah.
Something that stands out to me a lot as a genre is how representative of society so much of ska actually is. The book is extremely diverse. It's multiracial. It's varied in sexual orientation throughout the book. And, growing up going to punk shows in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of ska is very much in stark contrast to the 90s punk that I remember growing up and seeing. And ska and punk were so much in tandem, and I would like see punk bands like, preaching like unity and things like that from the stage. But then when you look at who is on stage at punk shows, like I would go see a 5 band bill and it would be all white, all male for the entire night. Ska seems different. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering
Yeah.
if you have any specific comments in relation to my observations about the diversity within ska. Uh, I don't care if you talk about how it compares to punk, but I'm curious about your observations of that as well after having done all this research for the book and the podcast.
Well, I'll say the first thing that struck me about that Skank and Pickle show wasn't necessarily that. I mean, Skank and Pickle was a band that had an Asian American male as one of the main singers, and then their guitarist was an openly gay woman. I'm not. That wasn't the first thing that struck me about the band. What struck me first was that the audience was diverse, and I
Mm,
and by diverse I mean like came from different worlds.
mm,
Like you'd see metalheads, you'd see kind of, you know, weird hippies, you'd see all kinds of people. Like, I think seeing how welcoming ska was and how like there wasn't this sort of like uniform, and this was true for ska punk. We can get into a discussion about what the traditional ska scene was like in the 90s, and that's a little different. But the ska punk scene in the 90s was like super welcoming and like very inviting, and kind of like in contrast to some of the other shows I'd been to that were kind of scary. Like I was really into Primus,
Mm-hmm.
and their audience was kind of scary.
Yeah.
Like I don't know why exactly that's the case, because it's kind of, since they're such a weird, goofy band, but it was like they were kind of, it was intimidating as like as a little kid, who wasn't violent or didn't have like this violent urge that you needed to express. I was like, I
Yeah.
love this music, but God, I feel weird being here. Being at the ska shows were like not like that at all. It didn't feel violent. It didn't feel aggressive. It didn't feel like gatekeepy at all. It was just like everyone's welcome. It's fun. It's kind. People, you were making friends with people just because they were there. Um, I don't know. So I would say that was the first thing that struck me about ska, going to ska in like the early mid 90s. In terms of diversity, yeah, I mean, I think, I understand a lot more about the diversity now. And I think I began to understand that more as I was becoming a fan, is that if you look at the bands and you look at the audience and you compare that to other genres of that time, there were more people of color in those bands and in the audience than there were in a lot of other like rock oriented alternative subgenres at that time. I mean, like I said earlier, Skank and Pickle, Mike Park was an Asian American man. There wasn't a lot of like Asian American people in punk really at the time. Lynette was an open lesbian, and
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a Christian home. I didn't have much experience with the interacting with or gay people, I guess. And the church I grew up with, the church I grew up in was very homophobic, very anti-gay. And while I wouldn't say I was committed to those ideas, I definitely probably had negative biases as a young person, having been grown up that way. But I know having been a fan of Skank and Pickle and having become friends with them and getting to know Lynette, I'm sure that factored in hugely to me seeing homophobia as a very bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah, if I wouldn't, I've talked about this on one of my other podcasts a lot, but if I hadn't found certain songs that framed social issues in a particular way, um, it's very, very likely that I would have gone down a really dark path because of some of the friendship groups that I was associated with in
Mhm.
middle school who were into some of the darker aspects of like what was going on in metal, for example. So it's I blame I credit music so much for
Oh
for
yeah.
helping me learn about stuff like that in the world. It really opened my eyes in ways that school teachers never really were capable of.
Yeah, me too. I mean, not only was going to ska shows, but also, going to DIY punk shows, and sort of when I was doing Flat Planet, being part of that sort of DIY punk scene, because we would do tours and play these like basement shows, and you would get to meet all these people in these scenes in different cities. That like exposed me to like a totally different world than this very religious home that I grew up in. And what's interesting is that it took me until I was in my early 20s before I had like confronted the fact that I was not a Christian.
Hmm.
I kind of existed in this space for a while where I was like, I guess I'm Christian, but whatever. And I was a little bit loosey goosey with it. But I felt like when I was in my early 20s, I had to confront it. I had to sort of decide, do I believe this? Is this who I am or not? And one of those things I felt like kind of came to my head was the idea that I did not feel anything negative towards people who were homosexual, and that I was
Hmm.
consistently told that I was supposed to. And
Hmm.
even though I'm a straight man, I'm not personally, like, it's not something part of my personal identity, but I felt so perturbed by that particular point of view that I just felt like I can't buy into this.
Yeah, it resonates. You mentioned cities. I grew up in St. Louis, a city with a rich ska past. Some of the bands that I was, exposed to, where we had an unexpectedly strong ska scene were obviously the mighty MU330,
Mm,
Orange Tree, who derived from MU330,
yeah.
a band called the Rabies, also that splintered off of MU330, but also smaller bands, Fat Cactus, Jimmy Got Hustled, The Scholars, um, Murder City Players, Radioactive Bananas, Secret Cajun Band. There was a lot in St. Louis. And so, I'm sure that you found some places that probably had some unexpected surprises as well. You've already mentioned East LA and the unexpected surprises there and in Mexico. Were there any other cities that you kind of dug into where, because we had a ska festival, Ska-orama, every year at Casa Loma Ballroom. I'm wondering if you had any unexpected surprises as far as like really cool ska scenes in the country that stand out to you.
Uh, One city that I was totally unaware of having such a vibrant ska scene before I started my book is Long Island.
Mm.
I have no connection to Long Island. I grew up in California, but I did a chapter on Jeff Rosenstock, discussing his ska roots,
Mm-hmm.
and I also
Arrogant sons of bitches, right?
Arrogant Sons of Bitches. And I also did there's a section in a different chapter where I'm talking about, people having ska roots, people that are not ska, that have ska roots and how that's been dealt with in culture, right? So one of the main people I interviewed for that chapter was Dan Deacon, who is like became a pretty popular, pretty cool, like electronic artist. But
Mm-hmm.
he played in a ska band for a number of years before that called Channel 59. So,
Nice.
which was awesome. Anyways, both of these people are from Long Island. And so I inadvertently was learning about Long Island scene through trying to set up Jeff Rosenstock's ska years and through setting up Dan Deacon's ska years. And I dove a little deeper into that with the second edition, just seeing how many people brought it up on the podcast. Like if they came from that area, it's like, oh, Long Island was amazing. They had a venue called Deja One where it was just like ska shows every week. They had they had like these sort of different generations of ska bands. Like what is the main Scofflaws were like one of the older bands, and they're a very
Mm-hmm.
cool band. Kind of, I don't know if I would call them, they're not really traditional, but it's definitely more recognizably jazzy ska stuff, right? And they were around the scene. Those are like guys that started in the late 80s. But then you have bands like, Jeff's band or Channel 59 and all these other bands too, who are like kind of like crazy kid energy. And they're all kind of sort of coexisting together. Brian Diaz from Edna's Goldfish, that's another band from that scene, that era. So, anyways, I learned all about that scene.
Man.
There's a guy named Sean McCabe who was in a band called Premarital Sax, who I've
Oh,
become
fun.
friends with. Yeah, I know. Best ska pun
Yeah.
name ever. No, he's a friend, and he like really for the second edition, he just like gave me the details about Long Island scene, so I could really fill it in for mostly the Dan Deacon chapter. Like that was pretty fun. That's fun to find that stuff out, because you always hear Orange County is the one you always hear about because that's where like a lot of the bands that blew up came from, and it was a vibrant scene. But those scenes existed all over the country.
I love it. You mentioned friends too, and this book has led to some new friendships for you. I know, for example, I never would have found you if you had not written a chapter about Chris Hanna and the band Propagandy from Winnipeg, Manitoba, writing a song called Ska Sucks, which you featured in the chapter. So I know you've made other friendships as well. One of my favorite chapters in the book is the way you incorporate a fan from Germany. A very cool story about a fan in Germany who collects obscure ska demos from the 90s. And
Mhm.
that story has stuck with me since the first day I read the book because to me, the way that you tie in fans is so important because it's like an exemplary way that of non-gatekeeping, right? Not only do you talk to people in bands, not only do you talk to people who have record labels, but you talk to people who just love the music. And, I'm wondering about some of your favorite relationships or opportunities that you've managed to cultivate for relationships stemming directly from, making the book, doing the podcast. What are some of your favorite like friendships?
Well, like my story is like a fan story.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I did
So
play in a band.
you're it, yeah.
I was a fan of Skank and Pickle, and I started writing fan letters to them. And the person who dealt with fan letters in Skank and Pickle was Mike Park. And
Mm.
so him and I became friends through me first writing letters saying, I love you guys. But I also, I went out on my way to write weird fan letters because I had this assumption that they're getting all these letters and like they probably don't read them or they probably throw them away. So I got to stand out somehow. And so I just wrote these crazy letters, and they went on for pages. And then Mike at one point, he would write back, but then at one point he's like, give me a call. Here's my phone number. And we started talking on the phone. We started hanging out, but he later told me that the reason he gave me his phone number is because he didn't want to have to read my long letters.
Amazing.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, otherwise, I would say like, I've gotten to know, I would say the people that have interviewed for the book or the podcast that I've become friends with in a more meaningful way are almost always like the ska bands. We bring on people outside of ska and super friendly interviews and that kind of stuff. And I might chat with them here and there a little bit outside of the interview. Like we had John Ross Bowie on the show from Big Bang Theory, and I've chatted with him a little bit since the interview. Like when we did Bill Stevenson. Bill Stevenson came on the podcast, and he had this whole thing about where he has this whole stretch that he does, and he sent
Yeah.
us a video after the fact showing us the stretch.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I was like, I bet John would love this because he's a big like pop punk fan. And I sent it to him, and he laughed, and we talked about it for a little bit. But that kind of stuff, that's friendly. But like the ska bands, like whether I knew them back in the day or kind of knew them back in the day or didn't know them at all back in the day, we're all becoming like much better friends. Like the guys from Mustard Plug, for instance, like pretty good friends with them now. But I didn't really know them personally back then. I was just a fan back then.
Yeah.
And I think they all like really respect what I'm doing and what Adam and I are doing with the podcast.
Well, let's talk about Adam. The podcast just started before the book came out, as you mentioned, taking on a life of its own. Adam Davis, your co-host, was the guitarist in one of my all-time favorite bands, Link 80, and now is the singer for the almighty Omnigon, whose record No Faith I have right here from Bad Time Records, an amazing record label doing fantastic ska right now, and I've got it on very gorgeous blue vinyl. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with Adam Davis doing the podcast, because it's so special. When I listen to the podcast, it's like, here's my time with you guys, and it means a lot for listeners.
Well, we first met in high school. He's a couple years younger than me, and I don't remember specifically how we met. He says that we met at a Cure show, which I know I remember him. I remember him being at the Cure show, and I remember talking to him. I don't remember if that was in fact the first time we met, but we'll just take Adam's word for it. That's when the first time we met. Cure played at a San Jose. God, it was this gigantic arena. I had no idea the Cure were that big. This was right when they had that right when Wish came out. So yeah, everyone that I know knew that was into cool music was at that show. So Adam and I apparently met at that show, and we were, I don't know that we were close friends. We were within the group of people that were friends or friendly with each other. He and I started a band after Flat Planet called Fashion Police, which was a bit of a reaction to band stuff. It was like we're going to make a band do just weird songs and just be a little bit on the performance art side of things, be confrontational, have no intention of making this band be anything. It was kind of like a cathartic outlet for us. And we tapped Adam to be in the band as the guitarist. And I don't remember after that. I know we kept in touch. We eventually started our own band like in like 2008 or 2009 called Narboots, which was kind of similar. It was more, but it was done in a less like aggressive way. It was like kind of confrontational and kind of like weird and theatrical. We did that for right up until about 2018. We haven't really done anything since. He started doing Omnigon, and I was really heavy into my book, so I just kind of didn't really have a lot of time, and there hasn't been much like impetus to start again, although we do talk about it every once in a while. But definitely through the Narboots years, him and I became like much, much closer friends, and to the point where we now like jokingly refer to the podcast as like the new season of Narboots.
Perfect. Well, if I can blow your mind here real quick, I don't know if you know that I have this, but I have 1 of 5 of the Narboots test pressings.
Wow.
Here is my number 3 of 5 test pressing from Narboots' album titled Album.
Mhm.
And it's signed by Mike Park. It was my little certificate of authenticity. But I have the Narboots 1 of the 5 test pressings that I got directly from Mike a couple of years ago. So there's my mind-blowing Narboots edition. And I knew I had to have that ready because I knew that Narboots was going to come up, and I was like, I got to show Aaron I have the test pressing.
That's amazing. The funny thing is that album is like basically just punk rock songs, right?
It's great. Yeah, I just listened to it today. I had this test pressing on no more than 2 hours ago in my house. And, I just had to tell you, I had to show you that because I knew you'd love it.
But the band, like, pretty much after that became an electronic band.
Yeah.
Like, we just would play electronic backing tracks on our iPod, and we would sing, Adam and I with our long extended mics. I don't know. We didn't want to go wireless for whatever reason. And, we would sing in the audience. But yeah, we moved away from actual guitar, bass, drum, punk, pretty quick.
Yeah. Well, my favorite episodes, I've listened to not all, but many, many, many of your episodes. And I just wanted to tell you some of my favorite podcast episodes. So if anybody out there is listening, is curious, where do I start with In Defense of Ska? Here's my personal list. Anything
right.
involving Mike Park is
Yes.
wonderful. The episode with Matt Bettinelli Olpen from Link 80, who is also now a major Hollywood director who is attached to the Scream franchise. That episode was amazing. Barry Johnson from Joyce Manor, loved it. Steve Choi from RX Bandits. Brendan Kelly from Slapstick, the Lawrence Arms, and the Broadways. Kamala Parks, who is an absolutely legendary figure in punk and venue management and booking and everything that people might not know. Reed Walcott.
And Kamala is like a really important name in terms of the history of Gilman specifically. I should add that in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Reed Walcott, We Are the Union. Laura Jane Grace from Against Me. Jay Navarro from the Suicide Machines. Dan Pothass from MU330. Brad Logan from Leftover Crack. Angelo Moore, who I know was most likely an insanely special interview for you, considering your adoration and love of Fishbone. Rory from the Impossibles, Rory Phillips from the Impossibles and the Stereo, who went on to come on my podcast after coming on your podcast. But a few more that I really love is the Blue Meanies, John Darnielle, Beto and Soundclash, Joe Gittleman, Dan Ozzie, and this one, the Abrupters from Buffalo, New York.
Yeah, your neighbors.
Because they are my neighbors. I love the Abrupters from Buffalo.
And we mentioned you. Yeah.
And I get talked about on that podcast.
Yeah.
It was an amazing story. And so those are some of my favorite. And I'm wondering if you had any other ones that you're like, off the top of my head, these are a few of my favorites that I'm just like so blown away that I got to do.
Well, Fred Armisen is a guest that we've had. That was pretty amazing. It was really amazing just how friendly and gracious he was.
Yeah.
And he did not rush us. We did a long interview. We did some bonus stuff for that too. And he was totally fine with that. That was a fun interview. One of my all-time favorites, and it's kind of a little outside of what we normally do, but it will always probably be my number one interview, is Tim Capello, the saxophone player from the film The Lost Boys.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Tim Capello, he's like, the sexy sex man. That's become a thing, right? And it's been a parody of his moment of that film. I had a connection to him from some of my journalism that I do. And I was like, oh man, I would love to have like a really long interview with him. I don't think he has any connection to ska, but who cares? I just want to talk to him. And so we brought him on, and he's like, I don't know anything about ska. I'm like, that's fine. I just want to hear your stories. Cause I heard some of his stories. He's got some incredible stories. And we brought him on. And then for the first half hour, he's talking with just encyclopedia knowledge about Jamaican ska. I'm like, you don't know anything about ska. Sure.
Wow.
But then it's like we tell his stories, and he used to play with his main gig was Tina Turner. He played with Tina Turner for a long time, and
whoa.
And this is like Tina Turner at her absolute commercial peak, right? All through the
Unbelievable.
80s. Yeah. When he did the Lost Boys in the early 90s, he was like had a couple day break from touring with Tina Turner. So to him, that was just like this little weird little thing he did. And then he's back to his real job. But it's sort of the thing that became like identifying him in the current time. He played with Carly Simon. He played Peter Gabriel. He did like a comedy thing with Billy Crystal. So he's just got rock and roll stories for days.
Jeez.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, and Fred Armisen too, going back to that. Fred Armisen has been super active in music. He just wrote like the intro to the recent No Means No biography that came
Oh, did
out
he? Wow.
recently. Yeah, so Fred Armisen, I'm glad to hear that he's just a music fan. He just seems to love music and just love talking about it. So I'm loving that you had a great time with Fred and that he didn't rush you through the interview to get to the other side for the next thing on his schedule for the day.
Yeah. Are you familiar
Very
with
cool.
Fred's band
A
from
little
the
bit
90s? Yeah.
Trenchmouth, right?
Trenchmouth, yeah.
Very cool.
They're very much in the vein of Fugazi, but I would say they're actually have a little bit more ska, reggae, dub elements than even Fugazi.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I loved in the book where Mike Park from Skank and Pickle and Asian Man Records says that Skank and Pickle could have been the Fugazi of ska because I couldn't say that I disagreed with that either. And I liked that that was included in the book too.
yeah. Skank and Pickle
Awesome.
were a very, very do-it-yourself band. I mean, they ran their own record label, they released their own stuff. And the thing about Skank and Pickle, and I think I made this point a few times in the book, is that they're not really remembered too much by people who weren't part of that at this point because they
Yeah.
didn't have songs on the radio. A lot of their records, I don't think, are as good as some of their contemporaries in terms of recording and stuff like that. But at the time, they were like probably one of the biggest bands.
Hmm.
Like Skank and Pickle would play to 1,000, 1,500 people on tour. Totally independent band, releasing their own records, just building this fan base up all on their own. And
Hmm.
I would say Mighty Mighty Boss Tones might have been the oldie band. You know, this is before those bands were on the radio. Mighty Mighty Boss Tones had a huge fan base before they had a hit single. I'd say Mighty Mighty Boss Tones was probably the only ska band that was eclipsing them at that by the time Skank and Pickle broke up in like 95.
Wow. Amazing. Um, the second edition you mentioned earlier, I want to talk just a little bit more about that. It contains that chapter at the very end where Patrick Stump from Fallout Boy
Mhm.
comes in there and kind of talks a little bit about ska. Um, but it's a brand new chapter. Like, what was that writing process like for that brand new edition that went into the book that didn't complement the other chapters, but is just a brand new standalone thing for the second edition?
Well, one of the things that inspired me to do this second edition, there was a couple things, but one of them was addressing some of the things that either I felt personally was missing or I was hearing from other people that said was missing.
Yeah.
And so I was putting together just a couple different things. And one of the things that I noticed that they were all sort of connected to was that they were addressing a lot of what was happening after ska fell out of the mainstream. So ska kind of peaked in like 97, 98. It's starting to go down. By early 2000s, it's considered a dead genre.
Yeah.
But it's not actually dead. It's like it's kind of gone into the underground a bit, right? And so in the last few years, you're starting to see a little bit more like some of the bands that are happening right now, like Catbite or We're the Union or Bat Operation, Kill Lincoln.
Hmm.
These bands they're not in the mainstream, but they are starting to get outside of the ska bubble. And so people outside of ska are starting to notice them.
Yeah.
So there's kind of been a conversation about like ska's back or is there a new ska revival or new ska wave happening? So these conversations are happening now. And so I found that I was talking a lot about the period between the early 2000s to the present time. And so I called it the lost years
Yeah.
because it's like, whatever. It's maybe it's the dead period, maybe it's the underground period. What is it, But and so I this chapter goes through all sorts of little scenes or little moments that really illustrate where ska was at during these times. And in many cases, I think that there's a vibrancy to it. And in a lot of cases, I think it really exemplifies community because it's all very community oriented. And I think ska has always been like a community oriented music. And when it became a mainstream genre, I think that's part of some of the disconnect and some of the struggle that it's always had is because really it's a community genre. And when it's like put in this sort of MTV space, it really kind of has there's like a really uncomfortable thing about that where this music comes from everybody sharing, everybody working together, everybody building it, everybody getting something from it, not really rock starness, right? I mean, it's true to some degree with punk, but I think punk's history is a little different. And I think they've sort of worked it out and they've kind of created their own different tiers of what punk is. And there's all kinds of arguments about what's punk and is punk the music, is punk the attitude, ska. I don't know. Ska's a little different to me. I think that community spirit has been the lifeblood of it. So the Lost Years really shows different scenes of that community lifeblood over the years. There's like there's a traditional LA ska scene in the early 2000s with Blue Beat Lounge by Chris Murray. There was the Brooklyn Rocksteady scene in the early 2010s. The band The Frighteners came from that. What else was there? I talk a little bit even about the Christian ska scene. In particular, I'm interested in Five Iron Frenzy and sort of their return in 2013 because of the nature of them being a pretty overtly leftist band who are Christians. I think they had a pretty significant impact on a lot of like Christian kids, and their return was met with one of the record-breaking Kickstarter.
Wow.
Which was, that record was broken by someone else like not long after. But at the time they broke a Kickstarter because they were so meaningful to so many kids who grew up in the church.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about Big D and sort of the impact they had in the late 2000s, being a band who wasn't really mainstream, but maybe the closest of the ska punk bands that came out post the 90s boom.
Yeah.
And I talk about sort of Bad Time Records and these bands and kind of where they came from and what they came from, because there's a lot of factors that led to these bands having a more successful period right now.
Awesome. Well, Aaron, I'm so delighted with our correspondence of the last couple of years, what you and Adam have been doing over at In Defense of Ska, and just talking about podcasting kind of behind the scenes. And, working towards this second edition of the book, it was super exciting to me whenever you told me that you were doing this. I am so happy that I get to be the one to bring this conversation to the world, to feature this book on the network and everything. And I'm wondering if you can just tell listeners where to go, what to check out, if they want to follow along, see what you're doing, and see what you and Adam get up to, but also just anything you want to promote whatsoever. Go ahead and shout it out.
Well, the second edition of my book comes out in October of 2024, but you can pre-order it right now. And I ask kindly that if you're interested in what I do and you would support ska, that you pre-order it, because it'll help sales. It'll help the algorithms, say that this is something to share with more people.
Yeah.
So go to clashbooks.com and go to new books. You can pre-order it right there. For the podcast, In Defense of Ska, you can get it wherever you get podcasts. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. The handle is @In Defense of Ska on all of those.
Wonderful. Aaron Carnes, author of In Defense of Ska, the first and second editions. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Fuck you, Rudy! Scott sucks! Attitude, you stupid fuck! And if you don't believe me, you're smart! Stupid fuck!